You're watching or listening to Exhibit A, the conspiracy theory podcast for people who don't wear tinfoil hats, but maybe keep one in the drawer just in case. We take a long, uncomfortable look at American history. The parts they printed, the parts they buried, and the parts that might have been fiction from the jump. If you're here for sanitized versions of events, this ain't it. But if you're here to tug at the threads, flip the stones, and maybe lose a little faith in your high school textbooks or any other book, welcome aboard. Every case starts with a motive. Why did they do it? What pushed a group of God-fearing, church-going English people to pack up their lives into a wooden coffin with sails and head into the unknown? It wasn't gold, it wasn't power, it wasn't even adventure. No, this was the deadliest motive of all: religion. England, late 1500s. Elizabeth I, dead. James I, he has taken the throne. The official church, the Church of England, is supposed to be compromise, the middle road between Catholic Rome and the Protestant Reform. But for the Pilgrims, it still looked like Rome, just with better lighting, fancy robes, stained glass, bishops waving incense all around. The whole show. To them, it wasn't worship. It was idolatry, just now with an English accent. They wanted simplicity. Strip it down to the studs. No bishops, no prayer books, no halfway measures, just a Bible, a sermon, and enough guilt to last all week. These were the Puritans. But the Pilgrims, they went one step further. They weren't interested in fixing the church. They wanted out. Like that guy at work who quits and starts his own company, and he tells everyone else they can go to hell. Yeah, that's these kind of people. But here's the rub. Skipping Sunday service wasn't just bad manners back then. It was illegal. The law said you had to show up at the state church, sing the state hymns, and pretend you enjoyed it. Refuse, you paid a fine. Refuse again, you faced prison. Keep it up, you could lose your land or worse. Picture that, getting tossed in the Tower of London for what today amounts to hitting the snooze button and skipping church. These people weren't rebels with guns. They were rebels with bad attendance records. So the heat was on. The separatists, as they called themselves, were already under surveillance. Pastors jailed, congregations broken up, and with the law breathing down their necks, they made a decision that would set the stage for everything that came after. They'd get the hell out of Dodge, or in their case, the hell out of England. Motive established: religious persecution. They weren't looking for freedom in the American sense. They were looking for freedom to worship their way, and literally to hell with anyone who disagreed. That's the case file, but it's just the first clue. The trail leads us to Holland next. When you're on the run, you need a safe house, somewhere to lay low until the heat dies down. For the Pilgrims, that was Holland. In 1608, they slipped out of London and landed into Leyden, a city famous for religious tolerance. They didn't care how or who you worshiped there. Sounds like paradise, right? Wrong. Freedom's great until the rent's due. In Holland, the Pilgrims weren't persecuted. They were broke. The jobs were hard. The pay was worse. And the Dutch didn't exactly roll out the red carpet. These people weren't masters of trade. They weren't nobles. They weren't bankers. They were bakers and farmers and tailors. So instead of living free, they lived tired, overworked, underpaid, barely scraping by in a land that wasn't theirs. And then came the kids. Their children grew up speaking Dutch, acting Dutch, and thinking Dutch. And that scared the hell out of them. Because there's one thing worse than persecution: assimilation. They weren't trying to raise little wooden shoe wearing Dutchmen. They were raising God's chosen people. And in their minds, that was slipping away. So, after a decade of freedom, they had another hard decision to make. Do they keep working these dead-end jobs while their kids frolic in the tulip fields? Or do they take a bigger gamble? Ditch Holland, cross the ocean, and start their own colony where no king, no bishop, no Dutchman could tell them what to do. Right? They chose door number 2. Freedom! Freedom in Holland wasn't enough. They wanted freedom on their terms, baby. Total control. Their church, their rules, their way. Which meant it was time to find a ride. Next stop, the Mayflower. 102 souls packed onto a ship too small for a school field trip today. Some were believers, some were hired help. All of them were about to test their faith against the Atlantic. Next up, the Mayflower job. Every escape has a getaway car. For the Pilgrims, that was the Mayflower. 1620, 100-foot merchant ship, not built for passengers, crammed with 102 souls. Half were true believers, the other half, strangers, adventurers, craftsmen, hired swords. Some were indentured servants, slaves. Some were debtors, and some, well, let's just say when you can't pay your bills or you've got the law breathing down your neck, signing up for a one-way trip across the Atlantic starts to sound pretty good. You don't pack that many desperate people onto a floating coffin without some secrets. Some historians think a few crewmen were running from debts back home. Others may be tied up with those shadowy groups we like to keep talking about. Masons, merchant guilds, even early intelligence networks. London was full of them. Did some of those strangers have their own motives for crossing the ocean? Sure. Were they hired and muscled to keep the religious fanatics in line? Yeah. Or eyes and ears for someone back in England? Definitely. We don't know. Yeah, we do. But it wouldn't be the last time shadowy players hitched a ride on history's big moment. And then there's the route itself. The Mayflower was supposed to land in Virginia. It was the contract, but they didn't. They wound up in Cape Cod. Was it bad navigation, storms, or was it deliberate? Some argue the Virginia Company, which bankrolled the trip, had its own fractures, rival investors who wanted to carve out a colony in Massachusetts, away from the established players. If that's true, the Pilgrims weren't just religious refugees. They were pawns in a corporate land grab. Imagine that. Rich corporations controlling the lives of everyone else. That would never happen. And here's a little tidbit. They drew up the Mayflower Compact, their constitution, before they even got off the ship. Think about that. Who just whips up a constitution mid-ocean unless they already had lawyers and scribes on board? It reads less like a survival plan and more like a pre-approved script. Was it really about keeping order, or was it the first draft of a new world system, cooked up before the anchor even hit the sand? Of course, there's the obvious conspiracy too. Divine real estate. The Pilgrims land to find empty villages, cleared by the plague just a few years before. Entire populations gone, like the table set and ready for them. To the Pilgrims, this was providence. But to us, it looks suspiciously like a convenient disaster. Germ warfare, whether intentional or not, has always been the dirtiest trick in the book. The question, was it a coincidence or part of the plan? So, the Mayflower wasn't just a boat. It was a floating conspiracy. Zealots, drifters, corporate pawns, maybe a few men with secrets in their pockets. They called it God's will. I call it a lead worth following. Next file, the worldview, scripture, superstition, and the kind of logic that can turn wilderness into the devil's playground, baby. Every maniac has a manifesto. For the Pilgrims, it was the King James Bible. Their worldview wasn't just faith, it was evidence, motive, and the weapon rolled into one. They saw themselves as the new Israel, handpicked by God, marching into a promised land, and anyone living there, just collateral damage. That's not happening, is it? They quoted Hebrews 11:13, strangers and pilgrims seeking a better country. Psalm 2:8, ask of me, and I will give you nations. And of course, the big one from Exodus 22:18, thou shalt not suffer a witch to live. The last line wasn't a metaphor. It was a command, a death sentence for anyone who didn't believe exactly like them. A death sentence for anyone who didn't agree with them. But here's the conspiracy angle. Some of those verses, especially the ones about divine inheritance of nations, they weren't just Sunday sermons. They were the same scriptures cited by monarchs, bankers, and yes, secret societies that believed in a divine right to rule. You find the same justification in papal bulls, in Masonic circles obsessed with New Jerusalem, even in Jewish Kabbalistic sects, hunting for signs of the end times. Different players, same verses. Coincidence? Maybe. Or maybe Plymouth wasn't just a religious experiment, it was a test colony for something bigger. Consider the passenger list. William Bradford, governor, chronicler, separatist true believer, but also on board, Miles Standish, a professional soldier, not even a member of their church. Why bring a hired gun unless you expect trouble? Some hypothesize he was connected with English military networks, and those networks overlapped with the London guilds, fraternities, and shadowy merchant groups. The kind of men who didn't care about scripture, only land and power. And what about the strangers? The ones who weren't pilgrims at all. Some were Londoners of Catholic background. Some were rumored to be Sephardic Jews, hiding their identity after Spain's expulsion, selling under English names. Others tied to Dutch merchant guilds who had their own stake in the New World. What were they doing on a ship supposedly about religious freedom? Too many nationalities, too many identities, all packed together under one compact. a random collection of outcasts, or the makings of a controlled experiment, a micro-society set loose in the wilderness. To the Pilgrims, their wilderness wasn't just trees and rivers. It was the devil's playground. Satan lurking behind every howl in the night, every storm, every native village. But maybe, just maybe, that fear was useful. Fear makes people easy to control. Fear justifies witch trials, holy wars, even land grabs. It's the same script we see played out across history. Today, in the same script, whispered in lodges, cathedrals, and secret meetings back there in Europe. So, here's what we've got. A worldview carved out of scripture, weaponized by paranoia, and backed, maybe, by hidden hands with their own agenda. On paper, they were God's chosen people. In reality, they might have been pawns in a much bigger game. Next up, the neighbors. Every neighborhood has its locals. And when the Mayflower anchored in Cape Cod, Massachusetts in November 1620, the neighborhood wasn't empty. It had been lived in for over 10,000 years, probably longer. The Wampanoag, Narragansett, Pequot, Pennacook, and the Massachusetts people, whole nations with their own politics, alliances, religions, architecture, money systems, and grudges. But when the Pilgrims came ashore, it looked like the place had been cleared out in advance. Here's the timeline. Between 1616 and 1619, just before the Mayflower's arrival, a mysterious plague swept coastal New England, swept the entire East Coast and the entire continent. Historians still argue what it was: smallpox, leprosy, or viral hepatitis. Whatever it was a death sentence. The toll was staggering. Up to 90% of the native population from Maine to Massachusetts gone in 3 years. Empty villages, fields still tilled, tools laying where they had been dropped. To the Pilgrims, it was divine providence. They thought God cleared the way. To us, it looks an awful lot like a convenient biological disaster. So, who stood to gain? Let's take a look at the names. Massasoit, leader of the Wampanoag, the people who first met the Pilgrims. He had just lost most of his population to the plague. His enemies, the Narragansett, had been spared. When the Mayflower showed up, Massasoit was desperate. He needed allies. So he made a deal with the newcomers. Food, farming lessons, and peace in exchange for guns and protection against the Narragansett. Here's another name you might know: Squanto, the famous go-between. But his story reads more like a conspiracy than anything. Kidnapped in 1614 by an Englishman named Thomas Hunt, sold into slavery in Spain, rescued by friars, shipped to London where he learned English, and moved in circles that included merchants and investors tied to the Newfoundland Company, and possibly Masonic lodges back there in jolly old England. By 1619, he was back in Massachusetts, only to find his entire Patuxet tribe wiped out by the plague. He walked into the Pilgrims' camp like a ghost, already fluent in their language, already aware of their customs, almost too perfect. Here's the question. Was Squanto a survivor or an asset? A man who genuinely helped the Pilgrims survive, or a pawn groomed back there in Europe, sent back as a fixer for English interests? Remember, London investors needed a colony to succeed, and nothing greases the wheels like a miraculous interpreter who just happens to show up when the colonists need him the most. Other names to note: Samoset, an Abenaki from modern-day Maine, who first greeted the Pilgrims in March in 1621 with the words, "Welcome, Englishmen." How does a native from Maine, the New World, already know English? Easy. He'd been trading with English fishermen for years. But again, convenient timing. Chief Canonicus, the Narragansett rival to Massasoit, he saw the Pilgrims as a threat from day one. Smart. The Narragansett had the numbers, but not the guns. Guess who had the guns? Next up, Sir Fernando Gorges, or Jorges. Back there in England pulling strings, he ran the Council for New England, a joint stock operation handing out land patents to land they didn't own. Jorges had connections to the Plymouth Company, Masonic circles in London, and the Catholic investors on the continent. When epidemics depopulated the land, it wasn't a tragedy to men like Gorges. It was opportunity. There's a pattern here. Native nations fractured, their numbers gutted by disease that just happened right before the colonists arrived. An interpreter materializes out of nowhere who'd been living in England's shadowy merchant network. Rival tribes pit each other against one another, forcing alliances with newcomers, and every acre of land they set foot on was already mapped. Weird. Claimed and speculated by men in London who never even lifted a musket. You don't need to believe it was planned, because it was. But if you were sitting in a London tavern in 1619, watching the numbers come in, it would sure look like somebody upstairs was clearing the chessboard. So, that's the neighborhood. Not a wilderness, not an untouched Eden, but a war zone where plague, politics, and power players set the stage. The Pilgrims needed that for their survival. And maybe, just maybe, someone wanted it that way. Next up, vanished colonies. Because Roanoke didn't just disappear. It was a warning. So, what's the real story here? We've got Pilgrims fleeing England for religion. You got vanished colonies like Roanoke, leaving nothing but a carving in a tree. You got Salem-style witch panics. And captivity diaries that read like a horror novel. And suddenly, it starts to look less like a coincidence and more like a deliberate game. Who was moving the pieces? That's what we're digging into. Roanoke Colony, 1587 to 1590. 3 years. An entire settlement disappears. No bodies, just the cryptic word Croatoan carved into a post. On the surface, failure. On closer inspection, Roanoke was funded and supervised by Raleigh and his London investors, men tied to Rosicrucian circles experimenting with social engineering overseas. Jamestown, 1607 to 1610. Starvation, disease, and internal conflict nearly wipes out the settlers. Yet investors back another wave of settlers. Why risk so many lives? To test colonization logistics, control labor, and observe social hierarchies in controlled conditions. Plymouth, 1620. Pilgrims arrive in the aftermath of plague. Native nations weakened, land cleared, ideal conditions for a new colony. Could it be luck? Maybe. Or maybe the right people at the right time nudged the right pieces into place. Yeah, probably that. Witch trials and captivity narratives, late 1600s. Witch hunts weren't just about religious zeal. They served as social control, reinforcing fear and obedience in communities that were still fragile, still being molded. And the captivity narratives? Stories of abducted colonists, like a girl taken in the 1600s you might have read about, were circulating widely. Just the right blend of horror and morality to justify expansion, aggression, and authority. The suspects, hidden networks. Merchant adventurers of London. Funding these voyages, benefiting from natural resources, land speculation, and colonial monopolies. Rosicrucians, proto-Masons. Intellectual and occult circles obsessed with New Atlantis, social experiments, and hidden hierarchies. Jesuits and European religious orders. Not direct actors, but part of the backdrop. Every colony, every epidemic, every alliance measured against continental power struggles. Shadow operatives, hired hands and strangers on the Mayflower and other expeditions, possibly embedded to observe, manipulate, and report. Names to remember: Stephen Hopkins, Thomas Weston, William Brewster. The methods: epidemics and demographic advantage. Plague hits native populations before English arrival. Convenient? Maybe. Manipulation? Probably. Selective alliances. Figures like Squanto and Massasoit placed in positions that favored colonial survival, possibly guided by hidden networks. Propaganda and fear. Witch trials. Captivity stories and religious extremism all work to consolidate authorities, manipulate obedience, and justify expansion. Legal and corporate control. Mayflower Compact. Land patents. Colonial charters. All mechanisms to channel settlers' behavior toward investors' objectives. So here's the case on the table. Was Plymouth just a pious experiment in faith? Or were the Pilgrims unwitting players in a centuries-long plan by merchants, occult thinkers, and European power networks to shape a new world under their invisible hand? Did epidemic, witch hunts, and captivity stories unfold naturally? Or were they leveraged to manipulate populations and secure influence? You decide. I'm just presenting the evidence. History tells us the what, the when, but it rarely tells us the who or the why. That part is on you to decide by reading in between the lines. And in this case, the lines are smeared with blood, fear, and ambition. Ever wonder what it's like to be a kid in colonial America? Let me paint the picture. The forest is alive, but not friendly. Your neighbors might accuse you of talking to the devil. Your friends might vanish overnight. And in the distance, creatures loom that make a bear look like a lapdog. Welcome to 17th century reality, where every shadow hides a story. The Witchcraft File. Salem and surrounding areas, 1692 to 1693. Official record, 20 executed, 150 accused. Fear is a tool. Fear is a weapon. And fear is how power consolidates. Remember that. Names you need to remember. Samuel Parris, the minister whose paranoia stoked the panic. Tituba, an enslaved woman accused of witchcraft, whose coerced confessions fed the hysteria. Giles Corey, pressed to death for refusing to plead guilty, a grim example of authority's muscle. Some historians suggest local land disputes fueled accusations. But step back. Could this have been encouraged by networks of investors and clergy? Communities terrified of devilish plots were easier to govern, easier to exploit, and easier to manipulate for land and labor. The Abduction File. 1600s Colonial Girl's Diary. A young girl was kidnapped by a hostile tribe around 1635, as recorded in her diary, found years later. Brutally treated, she was forced to march miles into the wilderness, stripped of her comforts, and made to participate in alien to her rituals. Her diary survives only in fragments. They speak in fire and drum. My voice is small, my prayers unheard. Each night I dream of England, yet awake to a world that does not forgive. Similar abductions were often politicized. Colonial authorities used these stories to justify attacks on native nations, reinforce the narratives of white peril in the wilderness, and strengthen dependence on the church and the militia for protection. Squanto Shadow. Some of these abductions might have intersected with European networks. Captives sometimes became pawns in a larger game, ransomed, traded, or leveraged to create alliances favorable to the settlers' investors. The Megafauna. The Boone Connection. Daniel Boone's family provides a rare window into the living wilderness. Settling in Pennsylvania and later Kentucky in the mid-1700s, they encountered mastodon fossils. Probably not alive, but mythicized and in the genetic memory of the people he talked to. Wolverines, he definitely ran into. Black bear, he hunted for money. That was the number one game for market hunting back then. I recommend the Meat Eater Network and Steve Rinella's book, The Long Hunters, and I think he has one specifically on Daniel Boone. Check it out. And elk that could easily kill a lone child or a 7-foot tall man. Predators that fueled colonial fears, both real and supernatural. Earlier generations, like those Mary encountered, faced creatures far larger than the settlers ever could have imagined. Wolves, mountain lions, and occasional bison herds were regular threats. The Boone family legend often mixes truth with exaggeration, but it illustrates just how dangerous the environment was and how the fear of nature, magic, and enemies blended together. Let's connect the dots. Witchcraft accusations, abductions, and encounters with megafauna weren't just random horrors. They reinforced control structures. fear of the unknown justified local authority, church power, and possibly the subtle nudges of hidden networks. Colonists learned to read the signs. Wilderness equals fear, equals devil, equals opportunity for social control. It's almost textbook. It is textbook. If you're the kind of person who writes secret charters and manipulates epidemics. So, what do we have here? Kids kidnapped, witches executed, families terrified by beast, real threats, yes, but also a pattern, a method. Was it simply survival in a harsh land? Or was someone watching, pulling the strings, making sure fear and superstition worked in their favor? You decide. I'm just handing over the diary pages and pointing at the shadows. By now, you've met the players, pilgrims fleeing England, natives navigating plague, kidnapped girls, keeping diaries we still read today, people with different religious beliefs, burned at the stake for survival's sake, and families like the Boones staring down the wilderness full of predators and full of opportunity. But the real question remains, who was really steering the ship? Sir Francis Walsingham, 1532 to 1590, Elizabeth I spy master. His operatives and methods persisted after his death, shaping European intelligence networks. John Dee, hell yeah, 1527 to 1609, occult advisor. Navigator of mystical and geographical secrets. Early mapping of New Atlantis. Sir Walter Raleigh, 1552 to 1618, the Roanoke colony founder, London investor, Rosicrucian. Roanoke vanishes, experiment or cover-up. Thomas Weston, 1587 to 1647, London merchant, financier for the Mayflower, connected to the merchant adventurers and shadowy Dutch networks. William Brewster, 1568 to 1644, and William Bradford, 1590 to 1657, Pilgrim leaders, officially religious refugees, unofficially conduits for investors' influence in Leyden and Plymouth. Colonial events and dates. The Roanoke colony, 1587 to 1590, disappears, leaving only Croatoan carved in a tree. Funded by Raleigh, backed by London investors, possibly a test for social control. Jamestown, 1607 to 1610, starvation, disease, near collapse, yet financed again, demonstrating the investors' persistence and experimental tendencies. Pilgrims leave Leyden, 1608 to 1620. Their journey, financed by the merchant adventurers, arrive in Plymouth post-plague, 1620. Natives were weakened and their land primed for settlement. Salem witch trials, 1692 to 1693. Fear and paranoia leveraged to consolidate power. Names: Samuel Parris, Tituba, and Giles Corey. Colonial abductions around the 1630s. Mary, kidnapped in 1635. Her captivity diaries show brutal treatment used to justify militia action and social obedience. That's what we today call propaganda. The Daniel Boone family era, mid-1700s. Look up Daniel Boone. He encounters megafauna in Pennsylvania and Kentucky, emphasizing the wilderness as a tool of survival, shaping the colonial experience. Pattern recognition. Epidemic, pre-cleared land for settlement, Roanoke and Plymouth. Witch trials and captivity narratives created fear and obedience. Megafauna and wilderness horror reinforced settlers' dependence on authority and structure. Colonies were experimental laboratories for social control, land speculation, and ideological influence. There's a couple theories of what happened here. Let's go over them briefly. Coincidence theory, that everything was accidental. Pilgrims, abductions, witches, and vanished colonies just happened to line up. Luck of history. There's the social experiment theory. Colonies were experimental laboratories funded by investors back in Europe, testing survival, obedience, and hierarchy under controlled chaos. There's the secret network theory. Rosicrucians, proto-Masons, and merchant syndicates intentionally shaped outcomes: disease, land grab, propaganda, even wilderness horror, to mold the new world for profit, ideology, and occult designs. There's also the long game theory. These networks never stopped. They evolved into later secret societies, banking dynasties, and intelligence organizations. Yeah, the Pilgrims were pawns on a century-long chessboard still in play today. It's probably a combination of all of those. The truth is usually somewhere in the middle, but the long game theory, that just is what it is. So here's what we know. The Pilgrims came for God, sure. But someone else might have come for power. Roanoke vanished. Jamestown nearly died. People with different religious beliefs, i.e. witches, were burned in front of everyone. Children were kidnapped. Families stalked by beasts. And behind it all, maybe, just maybe, the hidden hands in London and Leyden were quietly watching, quietly nudging, quietly making sure history went exactly where they wanted it to. History gives you the dates, the names, the pages, but rarely gives you the motives. That part, that's on you to decide.